Welcome to It Doesn't Hurt to Ask, brought to you by the Fundraising Lab. In each episode, we talk with shift disturbers in the world of philanthropy. These are folks who are shaking up traditional fundraising practices. On this episode, the Fundraising Lab's Cathy Mann talks with Paulina O'Kieffe-Anthony of Sketch. We hope you enjoy the interview. Here's Cathy.
Hey, welcome, Paulina. Thanks for being our rock star interviewee today. I want to start by briefly introducing you. So I did my research. LinkedIn makes it so much easier these days. But you really are, and I know you a little bit, but you really are a Renaissance woman, like spoken word artist, playwright, educator, fundraiser, stock investor, TEDx speaker, and recently the new executive director of Sketch Working Arts, which we also just call Sketch. You're also a mom and a travel junkie. And so the obvious question is, like, what do you do in your spare time? Because I'm sure you have a lot of it.
In my very minimal spare time, after all of that, I do love to read a lot. I'm really into like fantasy fiction or anything kind of based on magical realism and or kind of African-based spirituality. So a lot of think Children of Blood and Bone or Isabel Allende books, like those types of things. Right. I also spend a lot of time outdoors. Mostly you can catch me in forests around my area. I live in Windsor, so Essex County is surrounded by a lot of amazing walking trails, and most of the time I spend all my time in Point Pelee. So that's where I am when I'm not doing a million things.
Well, so I thought your answer was going to be, ha, 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 Cathy, what spare time? And so the fact that you actually do other things is that much more remarkable. So before we begin today's session, I do just want to say that while the magic of technology is bringing people together from many places, I'm actually speaking to you from Mi'kma'ki, the ancestral and unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq people. I'm grateful for the care that Indigenous peoples have exercised that have allowed me to settle and work here. And this territory is covered by what is called the Treaties of Peace and Friendship, first signed with the British Crown in 1725, and it recognized Mi'kmaq and Maliseet titles to lands and resources and established the rules for what was supposed to be an ongoing relationship between nations. Paulina, do you want to share any land acknowledgement or talk about where you're from?
Oh, absolutely. So I'm excited to be here with you all today, speaking from, as I mentioned, Windsor, Ontario, which is located on the traditional territories of the Three Fires Confederacy of First Nations, which is comprised of the Ojibwe, the Odawa, and the Potawatomi peoples. As a person of mixed Afro-diasporic descent, descending from immigrant settlers, I'm just beyond grateful to the Indigenous peoples of this land who have and continue to steward it in such a caring way and in a way that has really welcomed me to be able to live and work here. So
thank you very much. All right. We met because I've been doing some work with Sketch for the last 3 or 4 years. And when we first met 3 or 4 years ago, you were doing a number of different things. In fact, at the time, you were the executive director of a small arts organization, and you were doing grant writing for Sketch. And of course, you were performing and being a mom and all that other stuff. And you recently took on a new role. So can you tell us a little bit about your career journey and your new role?
Yeah, absolutely. So my career journey has always been very, very full. Just as busy as you see me now, I've always been that busy. Just because I love to have my hands in a lot of different things. I just get excited about projects, and particularly the arts and working in community. So I started working in community arts in my early 20s, and I was working with young people as both generally a program coordinator. I've held director roles, et cetera, at youth-led organizations. But then also as an artist educator. So on the side, I was still always doing like my poetry stuff in different communities around Toronto and beyond. And then eventually I worked my way into kind of leading a lot of these arts organizations, which is kind of where you met me at. And of course, I've always kept my arts practice intact. So I spend a lot of time kind of balancing those two spaces, being an arts administrator and being an artist. So both very rewarding, but also challenging to manage both of those spaces at the same time. And then kind of moving from the front, I would say now where I'm at Sketch. So you met me, and then shortly after I became the resource development manager at Sketch. And so was in charge of like all types of fundraising from donor solicitation to grants and everything else. And then last July, I moved into the executive director role at Sketch. And I would say that moving from fundraising to the ED role for me was not too difficult of a transition, mostly because I've already held a similar role as the director of outreach, which is where I came from to Sketch, but also because I had a really amazing mentorship and transition guidance from Sketch's outgoing ED, which is Rudy Rudiman. And I have to give her a shout out every time for supporting that transition. It was so great. I think my new role, though, definitely has new aspects with it. So I'm definitely more responsible for the overall organization generally and the general infrastructure of Sketch and kind of building that up programmatically, finance department, all those types of things. But I would still say that for me, there is still a lot of fundraising aspects to it, which is great because I get to build on the work that I was already doing in my previous role. So I think in the long run, coming into the ED role from the resource development manager role was actually a really good transition because it's really helped me for that aspect of the executive director role, I think, which depending on the person can be a tough transition or it can be easy. It just depends on what kind of background you have. Because I think the ED is one of the ultimate fundraisers of the organization. You're the face, you're talking about it, donors want to meet you, funders want to meet you. And so I think it gave me a good background to strengthen that aspect. I would say also as the executive director, I feel a lot more comfortable and more connected to the income generating side of the organization. And I think that's important because it helps me to kind of bridge the gap of what is possible. So in terms of programming and infrastructure. So I would say when you understand the fundraising side of an organization, it helps you as the person, in power, I guess, to understand that whatever you're dreaming, or in our case with Sketch, we're collectively dreaming and visioning about, you have a realistic approach to what is possible or how many steps it's going to take to get there or what funding strategies you're going to need to actually fund that thing to happen. And I think that's really important. And then what else it helps you to do is to figure out what the gaps are and then strategize around those things. So if you have a good background in fundraising knowledge, it just makes those visions, those strategic visions that we put together a lot more realistic, and we understand how we're going to get there.
Ready to stop guessing and start planning? In our upcoming free webinar, 5 Steps to Building a Kick-Ass Fundraising Plan and Actually Using It, discover the essential pieces required to make an actionable plan that will help you raise more money. With 2 dates to choose from, this webinar is hosted live on both Wednesday, April 6th at 12 noon Eastern and Wednesday, April 13th at 4 p.m. Eastern. In this free webinar, you will understand the purposes of planning, learn the 5-step process Cathy uses with our clients, discover the essential pieces required to make a plan that will help you raise more money, and have your questions answered in a live Q&A session. Sign up now for free at fundraisinglab.ca/webinar.
So I think it's safe to say that my fundraising background will continue to play a really significant role as I continue to move and navigate through the executive director role. And I'm very excited about that. I've learned a lot of skills as the resource development manager, and just even increasing my people skills. And, asking for funds is really hard for some people. And I am one of those people, but I've definitely been encouraged in this role, getting better at that.
So from your lips to the ears of hiring committees and boards all over the place for other fundraising professionals who may have aspirations to move into an executive director role someday. I realized, because I know you so well and I know Sketch so well, that I just jumped into talking about Sketch, but maybe you can let us know who Sketch is and what Sketch does a little bit, just for some context.
Yeah, absolutely. So Sketch Working Arts is an amazing organization. We serve young people 16 to 29 who are racialized, navigating the margins. And we do that through kind of engaging them through arts-based practice skill building, leadership, through a number of different programs. And we meet people at all different levels. We currently have a large studio and office space located at 180 Shaw Street in the Artscape Young Place building, which I'm very excited that will be reopening soon with all the COVID reopening. So we can have the hustle and bustle of young people again, which I miss very much. So that's essentially what we do. We do we have a lot of stuff going on this year. We're celebrating our 25th anniversary stints and doing radical art making with young people across the city of Toronto and beyond. We'll be having a 25th anniversary block party summer, so feel free to come out. It's going to be super fun. We are also part of Toronto's Year of Public Art. So we are part of Artworks TO, smaller Artworks TO projects. So we're wrapping up our public arts projects over the next few months with some really great pieces. So you can check it out at sketch.ca. And I hope to see some of you at the exhibits because they're just fantastic. We did 4 last year, 4 different projects last year with multiple exhibits, and they were just amazing to be able to engage the community outside of our space because our space was kind of closed. So now we'll be able to do both inside of our space and continue to work within the community with our arts practices.
I can only imagine how you're feeling. Like, I know how much energy there was in that space before COVID, and I know everybody's chomping at the bit to get back to be able to come together. But yeah, I know how important that is to you guys. So I wish you all the best as the restrictions loosen up and we come back together. So I have a question, like in terms of the fundraising work that you've done, and when we worked together, like the fundraising lab and Sketch, we did a lot of stuff on fundraising strategies, but we also spent a lot of time on the systems and processes, right? Like the database and planning templates and budgeting templates, that kind of stuff. I was struck by something you said to me when we talked last about the budgeting process after we had done a lot of that work together. And so is there anything, like as an executive director, that you can say about the basic fundraising infrastructure and how it has helped you going into, as the executive director, going into like your first budgeting and planning process?
Oh, yes. Lots to say about that, actually. So I'm going to start by saying that working with you and your team, Cathy, was absolutely fantastic. In my role as the resource development manager, I would say the systems and infrastructure that we worked on and built absolutely strengthen the capacity of the team to fundraise in a lot more efficient ways, because we eventually were able to kind of strategize using real data to guide us, as opposed to kind of, not that we weren't using real data, it just wasn't before, it just wasn't organized in a way that we could do so super efficiently. So now as the executive director, I have a very good sense of, what infrastructure works and needed to be built, what systems and processes need to be strengthened and how we refine them to kind of continue to achieve better results. But again, it all comes down to the work we did with you to begin a great foundation of data. And then that data really helped me so last year, we put together our annual budget, in the fall for the following year. And it really helped me to kind of understand how to put that budget together in a much more realistic way. Whereas I think before we were kind of like, this is what we need to do for the programs that we need to do. And then we're just like putting numbers down on the paper because that's what it costs and we'll figure it out somehow. We're really going like, we'll find a way kind of, but not really understanding how each piece of fundraising would work. So not really knowing in a really confident way how much we could really bring in grants, how much we could really bring in fundraising and donor solicitation. And I think that this year, because we had a lot more of the data to work with in this really succinct way, that, we did a draft budget. Then I took that draft budget and then I was able to actually work with our fundraising team to say, okay, what did we actually raise last year? And then I got to reorganize the draft budget to be like, okay, we actually have to repurpose some of these lines because we're based on our data, we're not going to raise as much funds here, but we might raise more funds here actually based on what we did last year. And I thought for myself as the executive director, that gave me immense confidence to present a budget to the board to say, not only to say, we are going to be able to do this, but here's the science, here's the data to back up what I'm telling you. And that really, when as your first time presenting a budget to your board, I think that really bolstered my confidence and made me feel good in the role as executive director to say there's work behind these numbers. And that also gave the board a lot of confidence when they're able to pass the budget to say, no, that makes sense. And we can see where it's coming from. So I thought that was really, really important. And I would say, I also feel like ensuring that you have systems in place is one thing. I think it's also in the journey of Sketch is that those systems are also actually speaking to each other. So for us, we definitely found out that everything from like your budget, you're creating your organizational budget, that has to speak to your finances and your financial reporting. That's, using QuickBooks, for example. And then that system also has to speak to your fundraising database, and they all have to be on the same page, because otherwise you have a bunch of different numbers and nobody knows which numbers are the most accurate numbers. And I think that's something I really appreciate that we learned, and having our integrated systems creates efficiencies that kind of really help you achieve the goals with less effort. And that is really important, because it means you're not duplicating work. You're not spending like time untangling miscommunication or trying to figure out the accurate data. And those are all things that create more efficiencies in your system. And why are efficiencies important? Because the more efficient your system, the more well your staff is. They're spending less time burning out doing a number of Excel spreadsheets, as I was. And a lot of that got absorbed in the database. And I'm so grateful for that, because it just means like I have more time to spend on strategy and going out and soliciting donors and applying to more funds through fundraising and that kind of stuff, because you're not spending all the time deep in the mud of spreadsheets all the time. So I thought that was a really interesting lesson on our journey. And I'm really happy that we're putting work in. We've invested the time and resources to kind of sync up our systems and utilize those systems. That's another thing. Don't just build your systems and not utilize them. You want to make sure that you're utilizing the systems that you spend all the time building, because a lot of us can easily get stuck in the comfort zone of things that we know, and again, brings us back to the inefficiencies.
In the nonprofit sector, we can have a love-hate relationship with our fundraising data, and because of it, we don't give it the attention it deserves. We know we need to align it with our fundraising activities and tighten up processes for reporting, but we don't know where to start. Nonprofits that prioritize data management are able to make decisions about fundraising based on that data. Being able to identify giving trends, respond to trends more quickly, reporting results to the board, and managing important relationships is key to improving fundraising results. This is why our managing director and resident fundraising tech expert, Anne LeMessurier, has created the Fundraising Lab's brand new course, Donor Database Essentials. Donor Database Essentials is the first of 4 courses each year provided through Spark Premium. Gain instant access to this course and more now. Head over to fundraisinglab.ca/spark/database.
Okay, so you're part of this new generation of leaders. What do you see as your opportunities, and what are your challenges? And like, feel free to answer this from any perspective, either being new in the role, or if you have observations about the broader sector, feel free to share that too. I'm really interested in hearing, because you mentioned Rudy Rudiman, who was your mentor and the previous executive director. She was a woman sort of my age, and you guys at Sketch are the kind of the example of what's going on right now, right? With leaders who've been in the sector for a long time moving on, and a new generation of leaders taking over. So yeah, I'm interested to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, I would say I'm overall very excited about the next generation of leaders that are coming up, and I do know a few of them. And I am excited because I really feel like we are going to bring some fresh perspectives and continue, because I know we've been building on the work, but we get to continue to kind of shake up the current systems and structures that are in place, which I think are very important, whether that be more reflective leadership based on the demographic you're serving, whether that be somebody coming in that is more connected to like new, that is bringing more new and innovative technology ideas, within the organization. I think we just have my generation of leadership has a lot to offer, and it's exciting to be given the opportunity to show what we are made of. So like I said, I see a lot of opportunities to be innovative, bringing ideas from various perspectives and lived experiences, which I think is important. I think you can only go so far in, your education or your background, but having a lived experience and being able to connect with other young people or other demographics of people that you serve that also have that lived experience brings just a whole different thing that cannot just be taught. Like, you're just able to connect with that. And I think that's really important. And I think that in my specific case, I really look forward to building alongside community even more. Sketch has a really great reputation for that. And I want to dive into that a little bit more, letting more voices who have historically been marginalized kind of help guide me as the executive director in decision making around where our organization particularly needs to be moving, right? Whether that be in programming, whether that be in the way that we use our space and support our community through our space, et cetera. I also definitely see challenges because let's face it, we still have a long way to go as we continue to work in the charitable sector that is historically based on in structures and systems that are still very much steeped in practices that aren't super equitable and that don't always serve marginalized folks in the best way. And so that's something we definitely recognize at Sketch and something I definitely recognize, throughout my journey in the non-for-profit sector, but it's even more heightened in a leadership level because you're interacting at the higher levels of that structure and system. And so you see a lot of things. And I think the challenge will be how to work within that system while also challenging that system at the same time. Like you have to ride that fence a little bit. So you're definitely dismantling and like trying to do the work within, but it just naturally goes at a pace that you're doing it, piece by piece, which can often take a long time and get very frustrating, but not to give up on that work at the same time. So I think the work, as I said, it does take time. And I know members of, particular communities are looking for that change. Like we're definitely in a place where society in general is like, been motivated, I would say, particularly since 2020, like through divisions that COVID has brought. And so it kind of ripped the Band-Aid even more on the disparities between different communities, et cetera, the Black Lives Matter movement and what was happening after George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and like what that has really spurred on in terms of the Black community, finding, missing women and children of residential schools in the Indigenous community. So all these are sparking fires. And you can see that there is even greater need and a greater push from those communities to seek change in these structures that we're kind of working in. And a lot of our charitable structure is very patriarchal and hierarchical, and a lot of those things don't gel well with the communities that we want to serve. And so just trying to balance being able to serve those communities in a way where they feel like real change is happening, and then and their expectations of what is going to be happening, and then doing the work of actual change at the pace that dismantling a structure or system or kind of shaking one up at the very least kind of takes, because these are huge systems and structures that have been grained and have been in place for a long time. So we're not going to just turn them over tomorrow. It's going to take a little bit of time, but reassuring the community that we are doing that work, that we are committed to that work, and that work will be ongoing as part of our commitment at Sketch. I think that's really where the challenge is. But I'm very up for the challenge, and I have looked forward to making whatever change I can possibly make through this position that I've gained as executive director. I think this is important that young people like myself, young people of color, racialized leaders are able to grab these positions and then take them and use them in ways in which our community is asking for us to make change. And so that's the challenge, and you're either up for it or you're not, and I'm definitely up for it.
Well, I'm delighted to hear that, and I think it's interesting what you talked about. Now, Sketch has always been a little bit, I don't know if it's ahead of the curve, but Sketch has been really about being community based and led by the community. But even Sketch comes from a historical context of a board that was pretty traditional board, and so I'm interested to hear more about your thoughts about that tension between continuing to shift things at Sketch, continuing to or perhaps having an additional focus on reaching out to the community and being kind of led by the community, but then also being that kind of organization in the context of the charitable sector, which is still pretty traditional. And still pretty traditional. We'll leave it at that.
Yeah, and I feel like you kind of nailed it right there, Cathy. Like with Sketch, I think it is definitely this three-pronged approach, which is like, for me, how to deepen our relationship with the community. So, one of the things that I've kind of noticed is like, where's our feedback loops? How does the community kind of in a larger way talk to us, especially as our space was kind of in and out closed during COVID. So before, a young person could just be there and be like, hey, I think you should do this, or and we need this. Whereas now that we're all virtual, how can we create more spaces even when we open, for community to come back and say, this is what we need from Sketch as a community, and how can we make that happen, and how can we work together to do that? So that's one aspect of, for sure. On the other aspect of kind of fundraising and like being in the traditional philanthropic circles that are Sketch, I think one of the interesting things that we have been doing and working on, and mostly spearheaded by Ruby Rudiman through Project Home, and kind of another thing that we're building on, which we haven't introduced yet, so I'll just leave it at that. But I would say what has been interesting is how Sketch has been looking at traditional philanthropy and figuring out ways on how we can radicalize traditional philanthropy in the same way that we radicalize our programming and the ways in which we work with community. And there have definitely been some inroads made, and there are definitely some opportunities to support philanthropy and philanthropists who kind of want to change the way, or are at least open to changing the ways in which they look at traditional philanthropy, how they can support a community, how we can work together and challenge power structures and hierarchical power at the table. It's been a very interesting kind of journey to look at that, figure out what Sketch's role is in that. And I think we're very uniquely positioned in the way that we are trusted by community, where also we have quite a bit of trust and from the donor community that we work with and investor community that we work with. And so kind of leveraging both of that and bringing them together to say a change needs to come in the way that we fundraise, or dollars are fundraised and then allocated to community programs. And we're, I think, in a really great position to, manage that tension and kind of bring about some really radical new ideas around how philanthropy can happen in, the community art sector at the very least, but even the larger, broader nonprofit sector, I would say.
I love everything you said. It's exciting to watch and see what you're doing to introduce some change, and I look forward to to staying in touch and seeing. I'd love to have this conversation in a year or two and see how this has all gone.
It was our pleasure to have Paulina on the podcast today. For more from Paulina, follow her on LinkedIn and check out Sketch at sketch.ca. If you found this podcast useful, we'd love if you'd rate and review it on Apple Podcasts. You can find this and many other resources on Fundraising Lab's website and social media. The music you heard on this podcast was Dog Days by Isaac Joel. And like Mama always said, it doesn't hurt to ask.